Hello, we're joined today by Graeme Blackett from Biggar Economics, Kirsty Tait, one of the Land Commission's Good Practice Advisors, and I'm Kathie, Pollard, Policy Officer at the Land Commission. So we're discussing the Biggar Economics work on assessing the wider benefits of reusing vacant and derelict land. I'm really delighted that we can have a conversation today about the findings of the report and the wider implications. Just to give you a bit of background, the Land Commission has 4 work streams, one of which is on housing, land and development, and the work on vacant and derelict land very much fits into that work stream. Part of the role of this piece of work is to understand more about how we can realise the full potential of vacant derelict sites and what we might need to do to change that. So just to kick us off, it would be really good to understand, Graeme, why do we need a new approach for the way we think and assess land reuse?
Okay, well, there are vacant and derelict sites in Scotland that have been that way for decades. And this is a waste of valuable resources, and such sites can be a blight on their communities. So why is this? One of the reasons is that the landowner, whether they be private sector or public sector, will usually imagine a future use. And so we'll have a land value in mind that is based on such a use. However, when reuse proposals come forward for such sites and a financial appraisal is undertaken, the financial returns may not justify the investment required. And this could be because of high costs of preparing the land for development, depending on the previous use, or it could be a weak market demand or perceived risks. So whatever the reason is, this will usually mean that the proposals do not proceed and the land remains vacant and derelict. So if you're doing what's not working, then it's usually wise to try and do something else.
Mm-hmm. And so what is different about this approach and to the way things are currently done at the moment?
So we do expect that sort of financial appraisals will continue to be undertaken, but we're proposing that a much wider range of costs and benefits are also considered. This will include considering the costs of not reusing the land productively, and it also considers the wider benefits of reusing land. Now, the starting point for thinking about these wider benefits is the Scottish Government's National Performance Framework. And this sets out 11 national outcomes that aim to capture the values and aspirations of people in Scotland. And those outcomes are about economic performance, but they're also about other outcomes, including for communities, the environment, and for health. So these wider benefits, once they've been identified, and the guidance provides a framework for doing this, they can often be quantified, and we're recommending that should be done where it's possible to do it. And those could be the economic benefits, such as jobs created by the land use, or they could be the value of health or environmental benefits. And then finally, we recommend that the fiscal costs of benefits are considered. Now, what we mean by that is the implications for public finances over time. So this can be done once the wider benefits and the economic benefits have been considered, and it will include thinking about the cost to the public sector associated with the proposed project. It could include cost savings, for example, reducing the costs associated with crime at a vacant site. And it also includes tax receipts, and that could be additional business rates or council tax. And actually, in many cases, such an analysis will find that the land reuse can have a net benefit to the public finances over time. So it's quite a different approach.
Mm-hmm. And obviously you touch on the different outcomes that are part of the national framework, and in the duration of the research you spoke to a whole range of stakeholders involved in a range of land uses. And what did that tell you about the appetite for change?
Okay, I must admit we're quite surprised about this. And the reason we were surprised is, I guess we started the process thinking, well, this issue with vacant and derelict land is not a new problem. And so we thought we'd come across entrenched views and an unwillingness. It wasn't at all what with the landowners in the public and the private sector, funders, government and its agencies and communities all recognise the need for change. And in fact, we found several projects where real efforts had been made to use a different approach, including identifying these wider benefits. But as with any change, there's a need for advice and guidance on how to do this well. And I think that's what people were looking for to feed through this appetite for change.
And you can find the case studies on our website as well, and they're really interesting and varied. And actually, that brings me on to who the guidance actually aimed at.
Yeah, well, we hope the guidance will be useful for anyone involved or considering becoming involved in any project that involves the reuse of land, and I guess particularly vacant and derelict land. So that it could include landowners, they could include land users, developers, funders, national government, local government, public sector agencies, and local communities. And I guess some people might be in more than one of those categories. And the guidance can be used both at the sort of project development and appraisal stage, to help sort of make a business case for doing something, or it can be used at the sort of evaluation stage, so after something has been done, to understand what the benefits have been.
So I guess in my job with the Good Practice, we're really interested in how making more of Scotland's land and how you actually get communities and landowners and managers working together more towards that aim. We know a lot of long-term derelict urban sites have blighted communities for many decades, and they are in areas where the private sector can or won't deliver the change that's required. So how can this new framework help those communities and help address that issue?
Okay, well, in terms of helping the communities, I think stakeholder engagement is always important, and so community involvement in this context is critical. And that there's kind of a wide range of potential benefits of land reuse, and the benefits that are most important, really the communities should be involved in deciding what they are, and the communities will also have a good knowledge about what the costs are actually of not doing anything, so of leaving a site vacant and derelict. And the communities will also have views that can sort of help identify and quantify what the benefits might be, because of course they will be amongst the beneficiaries of a project as well. I think there's maybe another question there in terms of the role of the private sector and where that interacts with communities in the public sector. Because where social returns on investment are greater than the private returns, there's a case for the public sector to get involved. But if that means that the public sector was simply to do what the private sector thought wasn't financially feasible, this would raise questions about whether this was the right thing to do with public money. So it's really crucial that the public sector and communities understand what the wider social benefits are, so that they can decide whether that is a good use of money and whether there's a good sort of wider social return of investment.
Sorry, we're really interested actually in the kind of smaller sites as well, and more community-led regeneration, reuse of those smaller sites. Why would you encourage community organisations like Development Trust, Community Land Trust, community enterprises to use this framework if they are keen or interested in approaching a smaller reuse project?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess one thing that is worth pointing out and is recognised in the guidance is the whole issue of scale. So the guidance recognises that the sort of effort that should be put into making a case for something really needs to be commensurate with the scale of the project. And that's something that is recognised by the UK Treasury when it's approving funding as well, that what you might expect from a community group working in a small site is quite different from what you might expect sort of a major developer or a public sector agency to do if they were looking at major regeneration. So there is something about the effort that might be expected. But I think what this guidance should help community groups do, it's really a way that it gives them a framework really for thinking about what the wider benefits might be, and therefore should help in terms of making the case for a proposal. And actually, by thinking through what the benefits might be, it also might actually help community groups in terms of defining what that project could be, and might even stimulate different thoughts that might help the project develop and change a bit in ways that would maximise those benefits. But really at core, what it means is it should give community groups a way to develop a business case that sets not just the rationale for what they're thinking about, but identifies the benefits and sets it in the context of sort of wider national objectives, because that's what the national performance framework is, that's the starting point.
And is there any lessons we can draw from the case studies that you looked at? I mean, was there any terms of any challenges or opportunities, or was there anything that kind of struck you from the case studies in terms of community involvement and leadership?
Well, I mean, I think what we did find in the case studies is where the communities were most involved, then there were a wider range of benefits tended to have been identified, because I guess the community groups looked at things in a different way from, say a private sector developer or a public agency. So it tended to actually be quite helpful in terms of identifying those wider benefits. What sometimes they found more difficult was actually quantifying some of those, or knowing basically how to take account of all of those things. And I think that's maybe a gap that this guidance will help fill, so that people will have a way of doing that wasn't there before.
Perfect.
Actually, that really resonates with the findings of a report we just published on the value of early engagement in planning. So I think that's really relevant.
Yeah.
So what are the changes in your view that need to be made to embed this more long-term approach?
Well, I mean, I think maybe what should be recognised is, I guess, the way things have been done up until now is it's kind of well established, and so you could say this is quite a big change, and so it might take some time to adjust. So I mean, I think what might be the biggest difference might be some success stories. So if there are examples of this new approach being used successfully, this will encourage others to follow. And I think there's also a role here for both national and local government as well, that some sort of leadership is needed. So the national performance framework is already in place, and I think it's up to decision makers, including public funders and agencies who might be approving business cases, to really make it clear that demonstrating how proposals deliver against the national performance frameworks will actually be the basis of the decision. And I guess when that is clear, it will encourage people to change. And actually, I'm quite encouraged that this is beginning to happen. And there seems to be an emerging consensus that the recovery from the COVID crisis, will involve a new way of operating. And the national performance framework is being mentioned in that context. And the consideration of the wider range of economic, social, health, and environmental benefits, I guess, of everything, so in terms of how we think of us as individuals, how organisations think, and sort of wider society, does seem to be at the centre of this new way of operating that's beginning to emerge.
Yeah, there is definitely a shift in sort of viewing this wellbeing economy type approach. And I guess you've already answered some of it, but what do you think the main challenges to applying this approach could be, and how can we overcome those? For example, there might be the argument that we can't afford to think more long term. Is that valid?
I mean, I think that will be something that needs to be considered. Yes, I mean, people might not be used to thinking like this. What we're proposing is really thinking in a quite holistic, systematic sort of way, and also thinking of the long term. So, I mean, vacant and derelict land is clearly a long-term problem, and so you would expect the solution to also require long-term thinking. And I do recognise that balancing short-term priorities and longer-term thinking is always a difficult challenge. But I think what's important to remember here is that this approach is not about looking at wider benefits separately from the financial costs and benefits, but looking at the financial, economic, wider benefits and physical implications all as part of the same assessment. And when this is done, it will likely show that productive reuse of land is a very good idea in the long term, but actually in many cases it will also show that the benefits can exceed the costs even in the shorter term, when all the benefits and costs are taken into account.
Because at the moment the land is not productive and is not seeing any benefits really, or very limited. Yes, and I think that's important going forward, particularly now the way we think about the potential of our assets in various communities. But do you think there is scope to apply this approach to wider land use projects?
Yeah, well, I mean, the guidance was developed with vacant and derelict land in mind. But actually, as the work was being undertaken, it became obvious quite quickly that it could be applied more widely. Because really what the guidance is recommending, that the widest possible range of social, economic and environmental costs and benefits should be considered, and that they should be quantified where they can be, that fiscal implications should be considered, so that the sort of private and social costs and benefits over time can be properly assessed. And really this is the sort of approach that can and should be used for a wide range of projects, and certainly for any type of land use project.
And rethinking the way we use and value our assets in our communities. Yes, I think that brings us to the end of all the questions we had for you, but it's been really interesting having a discussion with you about this. And you can find the reports, the case studies and the guidance on our website, and we're really keen to hear from anyone who wants to use the guidance or is interested in what we've said today. So please do get in touch with us. You can find the details on our website. But I'd like to say thanks again to Graeme and Kirsty for joining us today, and yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.